Hi there team, Rob here from the Better SMB podcast. Now, I know I always say this, but this episode is a doozy. It is extra special. We are talking to Dave Bunting, the most humble leader that you will ever meet. Now, who is Dave Bunting? You'll get to know him by the end of this episode, but he oversees a mere 47,000 square metre plant in the middle of the Waikato. And you just can't wrap your head around how big that is. But even better, he is running something special around the performance of that plant. And so we talked to Dave about excellence and how he breaks it down into such simple terms. It doesn't need to be hard or complex. It is just a mindset taking to lead one of New Zealand's leading manufacturing plants. It isn't sexy. It just requires deliberate and disciplined actions. Now, before I get on to the rest of the show, please remember, support us by hitting that follow button, give us a 5-star rating, do all the things you need to do to support this show. We are building something really awesome here. The momentum is growing and we need your help. We need your support. It really does make a difference. Anyway, that's enough of my ramblings. Let's get on with this episode. It is epic. So, on with the show.
Welcome back to the Better SMB. We're working to become the go-to voice for SMB leaders looking to create high-performing and sustainable businesses. I'm David Alterner.
And I'm Rob Bull.
Today we're joined by Dave Bunting, Managing Director of Architectural Glass Products and a leader with a blend of global manufacturing and deep technical expertise, combined with sales and a proven ability to build high-performing teams from the ground up. Dave is a specialist in turnarounds and startups with a track record of leading in high-pressure environments across international markets. At AGP, he's built more than just a factory. He's led the creation of one of the Southern Hemisphere's most advanced glass manufacturing operations. But more importantly, he's helped shape a culture where excellence isn't just a KPI. It's a lived experience. From robotic automation and real-time tracking to a people-first mindset and DIFOTUS rates that would make most execs jealous. AGP, under Dave's leadership, has become the benchmark for what's possible in New Zealand manufacturing. So I'm going to hand over to Rob, because Rob, I know you're pretty excited about talking to Dave about his DIFOTUS, which I've only managed to figure out how to say today. So over to you.
Yeah, no, this is a pretty cool one. It's on the back of EMA site visit, actually, when we first met with each other, which is another little shout out to those guys around fostering their engagement and that networking around identifying, showing, sharing, all of those things around excellence in New Zealand. And as a lean guy, it didn't take much to convince me to join in on the tour on this particular night. So before we go into my big questions, Dave, welcome to the Better SMB podcast. It's great to have you here. And can you tell us about the factory? For those who haven't driven the Waikato Expressway and seen that, I was looking at it at night last night, driving back from Napier, big gleaming, shiny thing on the side of the expressway. What is it? How big is it? What are you doing in that place?
Oh, hey, thanks for having me. First of all, Rob and David, pleased to be here. So AGP manufactures double glazing. We supply primarily the APL window network across the whole of New Zealand, approximately 77 customers that buy the aluminium from APL, and they also buy their glass from AGP. Yeah, big factory, sort of a bit of an icon building now in the Waikato. Yeah, 417 metres long and 108 metres wide. So I think the stat is it's we could land five 777 airlines in there, Rob, and still have 25 metres to spare.
Yeah. I explain that stat to people and they just don't get their heads around it. And I've walked it, and I do, because when you walk I got 10,000 steps up that day really easily. It is something really special. And although you've got a greenfield site, which is really a unique opportunity for many leaders, operational excellence and business excellence, when you're starting from the ground up like that, because the building's a building, but as David said in the intro, it's people led. So how did you start setting that scene around operational excellence or business excellence, call it what you like, with the team, and as it was growing, as it was developing into what it is today?
Yeah, great question. I was if we take it back a step, I was fortunate enough to start my career in New Zealand, and then I went offshore for 8 or 9 years and worked for an American company where I just got to work with a lot of people that were pretty skilled in that sort of operational excellence and culture building space. When we built AGP, we really said anyone can buy the equipment from anyone, and in fact, all our competitors have the same equipment. It's really culture and operational excellence that set that. So we just made very deliberate decisions around that. We didn't hire anyone, for example, from the glass industry. We just believed in a training mechanism that we can teach people, and just a continuous improvement mindset that sort of worked the top few things and just continually drive that and try to improve that day by day. And over a number of months and then years, those benefits stack and they become almost like compounding interest, inside the organisation.
Yeah. So what did you do specifically, if you can think back over, because it's been 6 years now, what you did specifically to help set that continuous improvement theme? I'm going to latch onto that and be quite biased as a leader, because I'm sure it started off with a smaller team, but then as it grew to just over 100 now?
110.
Yeah. Because that's a challenge that many business leaders, owners have, is one, setting the scene and then carrying it on for such a long time and maintaining that level.
Yeah, so I think specifically we just spent a lot of time in the early years ingraining that methodology through people. So we either hired them with that skill set, but in most cases we actually recruited quite a young team, some of them straight out of university. We taught them those fundamentals, and with the expectation that they taught the next group of people, right? And then that's evolved now to a point where we're actually trying to do a lot of bottom up from the operators up sort of processing and improvement. So that was the first thing we did, is that without the right people that have the right mentality to learn or are willing to learn that mentality, it's never going to happen. It's just never going to happen. So we put a lot of time into hiring the right cultural fit for us. And that varies across organisations, as you know, Rob. Just because someone is a good fit for my business, it doesn't mean that they're a good fit for others. So we put a lot of time into that. To answer your question about what do we specifically do, and then we went about building this sort of ecosystem where we would look at problems and track the problems and then work on them in a very systematic way. So instead of allowing signals of what's creating the most noise for today, we basically would step back, look at the data and say, well, what is the big issue over a period of a month, couple of weeks, and then systematically work through solving that one step at a time.
So data-led improvements, brilliant.
Yeah,
love it.
Absolutely.
So with that people-led culture, what are your non-compromise areas that you'll never trade in?
Yeah, the big one we push here is humility, because I think that is key, right? And when we mean humility, I don't mean, and this is mistaken a little bit in New Zealand at times, it doesn't mean that we're not proud of what we do. It doesn't mean that we don't celebrate what we do or when we have a win. What it means is that I'm open to someone else's idea, right? I'm open to being challenged on a decision or a path, and to be grounded in the facts of today, So we take the emotion aside and we say, well, what are we facing here? And then we can work through and systematically improve that. But if you don't have humility, it gets hard. It gets really hard really quick because you can't coach, right? You can't go looking for the next opportunity or the next improvement. Okay. When you do start to get some pretty good runs, it's harder and harder to find the next level, and you need a high level of humility to do that. And it also, the other thing with humility, I think, is it allows you to pivot. It allows you, which we've done plenty of times, where we've gone, that was the wrong call. That was the wrong decision. We need to pivot and we need to move away from that and look at that as a sunk cost and redirect where we're heading. So yeah, humility is a non-negotiable for our organisation. We prefer people that are a little bit entrepreneurial, that want to own things, that want to own what they do. Doesn't matter what role they have, whether their job is to drive the cleaning scrubber in our organisation to, a senior salesperson, they've got to own what they do. Because with ownership, typically we find out that we get way better contribution, right? And I think thirdly, just good people, Rob, people that just get along, want to win, and we're pretty firm on that. I think I mentioned when we first met that we're pretty proud of this. We say AGP is not for everyone, and we're okay with that.
Yeah.
So it's just accepting that. There's a lot of the signals coming at business owners, CEOs, leaders, junior leaders that you should be everything to everyone. But I think just accepting that's important.
100%. I really like that humility stuff. And it really, sometimes I like to get your opinion on this as a slight tangent or secondary question around this, is certainly part of my lean teachings that I help instill in organizations is celebrate the small wins, celebrate the big wins as well. But that kind of counteracts against that New Zealand Kiwi tall poppy syndrome and all of that kind of stuff. And so that humility and the way you described it, which was beautiful, kind of can clash against that tall poppy. How have you come across that, and how have you dealt with that?
I actually don't think we've come up against it too much, to be honest. And I'll tell you why. This is, I guess, a little humility on our part is we haven't always been great at celebrating the successes as we've grown the business. We've been so focused, we've almost gone the other way and being too critical and trying to improve on that now. So I don't know if we've come up against it as much, but I'm also very quick to remind people of that definition of humility as it applies to us, right? That we don't necessarily stand there and shout out about what we do. We're usually pretty publicity shy, but at the same time, you need both, right? You can't just sit there and grind away forever. It's
you need to add back into the emotional bank account.
Yeah, you do.
Right?
It just because. There's very few people in the world that can operate at that level all the time without ever pausing and going, hey, we're actually getting a win and this is cool.
Yeah. I don't think we celebrate some of the good, cool stuff that we're doing in New Zealand manufacturing and that kind of sector. I've just recently been down to the Hutt Valley Chamber of Commerce, their expo around there, and there's just some amazing things happening right up in Lower Hutt, Upper Hutt, and we don't shout it out enough and celebrate some of that good stuff from a macro point of view as well as inside an organisation at a micro point of view. Okay, just rounding off the segment around operational excellence, how does that look now when you're now fully into sort of day-to-day operations? For you and your leadership team or your middle leadership team, what does that look like on a day-to-day, weekly basis around supporting and encouraging and driving excellence at every step?
I guess one thing I'll say is that we don't have a traditional leadership team, okay? So we run a very flat structure. We do that deliberately because everyone in the organisation, we believe, has an impact on the customer at a varying point, right? And in fact, actually, I believe that the further up the organisation you get, for lack of another term, the impact to the customer actually becomes less. So a person making a unit and making sure the quality is good actually impacts the customer more than me in a lot of cases. So I think that's just a good thing to circle off. What we do from a day-to-day basis is, and it comes back to a little bit around that culture, is just making sure that we have an 8:30 meeting every morning, and it's very simple, right? You either hit the KPI or you didn't, right? And if we didn't hit the KPI, if we did hit the KPI, we carry on. No need to talk about it. Green, we carry on. If we didn't hit it, we need to quickly identify why we didn't hit it, and is it something systemic or something that's fallen over that we need to address right now? I call it triage, right?
Yeah.
And then the various teams go out and solve that issue. So, that for me is critical. And then it's really about taking the data and the signals and saying, hey, are we on track or are we not? Right? And if we're not on track, why are we not on track? And how do we correct that and get back on track? Right? And we want to do that as quickly as possible. And usually it's not complicated things, actually. It's not, I'll often remind the team that particularly when we're getting frustrated, we can start to look at some sort of weird voodoo thing that, Auntie Mary over, in the subdivision next door turns her microwave on and we start chipping the glass, because it's interfering with the machine. In reality, 99.9% of problems are much simpler than that. So it's just about identifying them with the data and then working through systematically and solving them, but doing it every single day and being consistent about that approach.
Yep. Because that's not normal. If you walked into most New Zealand manufacturing businesses, like, I'm going to roll them off from what I just heard. Stand-up meetings, daily stand-up meetings, for me, is a gold standard. And even teams I work with push back on that, going, that's you can't put time aside for doing that. So that's not normal. Triaging and putting time aside to solve the problem, that's actually caused the big one. Normally it's let's put the the plaster over the wound and let carry on and do the surface level firefighting. That's the typical one. And using the daily stats, using informed data to go and point you in the right direction, that's not normal. What did you do with bringing in some people, even if they weren't from the glass environment, to create that? That's just the way we do it, because that's an awesome discipline to have.
Yeah, look, we just created the ecosystem. We just said, hey, what does good look like? And a lot of the stuff's it's not. It might not be. And I agree with you. It isn't that common in New Zealand, but it's very common in a lot of other countries. And so I always say it's not what. This isn't some sort of special secret sauce here. There's nothing sexy about it, actually. It's actually quite boring. It's a bit grindy. It's the word I use. But you got to do it every day. So we just said, hey, we're having an 8:30 meeting every morning, and everyone goes to that meeting. And that meeting, I can count on a couple of hands how long that's gone beyond 15 minutes.
Yep.
But it covers every part of the business, and we're just disciplined about it.
Yeah. Love the discipline. Love the simplicity. Cool.
Yeah. So I think that's what we did, and new people that came to the organisation, this is what we do.
Yeah, right? Cool. I'm going to go on a slight sidebar here, because this is what it really drove me and put your guys in a big spotlight. What are your stats? All of that discipline, all that approach, that humility. Like David talked about DIFOTUS. I'm teaching him what that really means. So, an IT guy's getting there. What is your DIFOTUS? What's your rework rate? Because those are the two stats that just blew me away.
Yeah, so our DIFOTUS sits around 99%.
Insane.
Yeah, so typically that's on a 4-day lead time. So everything's just made just in time. Order on a Monday, it'll be in there on a Thursday. 5 days for the South Island. And 99% is the number we typically look at. It's been like that really from day one.
Cool. And your rework?
That includes, that's DIFOTUS. So if we were talking about DIFOT, so delivery in full on time, that's closer to 100%.
Yep.
Okay, our external reject rate is somewhere around 0.5%, and then we break a little bit on the truck on top of that. So it's pretty low. Yeah, it's pretty low.
Put this in context, right? For those who are normally in manufacturing, I'm rocking in there. I was talking to a team yesterday. Their Diphotis engineering firm is hovering around 60 odd percent. Not awful, not brilliant, right? Our goal is to get somewhere in the 70s. I think world class is somewhere in 85, 90%. You're 99, which is stupidly outstanding. So I celebrate that, acknowledge it. Well done to you and the team. And the rework rate. When I asked you that on our tour and you started it with point, I just knew, nah, that's pretty good. Because normally, again, rework is in sort of like at least 10, 15, 20, 30%, depending on the industry and the materials and all that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that in public. That's pretty dang awesome. So it can be done in a New Zealand mindset, in a New Zealand manufacturing. Yeah, it's a greenfield site, but it's not impossible to achieve these world-class levels in a New Zealand context. And that's, I guess, the point that we wanted to ask.
When we looked at building the business, where I'd come from in the US, there was plenty of people in the glass industry, in our part of the industry, hitting similar numbers. So yeah, it is achievable. It's hard, and it takes energy every day, and it takes work every day. It is hard, and I often, it's funny you raise that about the greenfield. I often get asked about that, and well, it must be because it's a greenfield. But the reality of it is that I've run plants that are 40 years old. 50 years old that are running, DIFOT numbers up in the high 90s.
Yep.
So it's often not about the equipment. It's really about that, just continuously working on the stuff that will move the needle and continuing to work on it. And then I think something that just doesn't get worked on enough is coming back and checking that plan, do, check, act cycle. But the check part, which everyone forgets about because it's not sexy, is to go back and go, hey, what we put in place, is it working and is it still being done? And that's frustrating. I get frustrated every day about it when we say, oh, we fixed that 3 months ago. Why is that person or why is that process fallen over? That's how you get there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not sexy stuff, and we've talked about that ad nauseum on this podcast a number of times.
So, Dave, I spent a bit of time reading the New Zealand Manufacturer article. Yeah. And maybe just going back a little bit where you talk around this flat structure and the fact that anyone can challenge a decision.
Yeah.
I was curious on where that came from. Like, I'm Ray Dalio. I follow Ray Dalio, and he's got a little bit of that kind of thing as well. Where did that come from for you, and what does that look like in the business?
Yeah. So I was actually I was trained by Coke Industries, which they have a very strong fundamental belief system in their organisations, and they live it. There's no doubt. It's not some poster on the wall. It is applied to every part of the organisation, and basically, fundamentally behind that philosophy is around free societies. What makes free societies prosper? And there's a whole bunch of stuff that makes free societies prosper, right? And one of them is decision rights or property rights and free markets, effectively. It's hard to recreate that in an organisation, but what it means is what we call a challenge process. So anybody's got the ability to challenge what we're doing or where we're going, but they should have comparative advantage to do that, right? I think this last piece is the most important part of that, which I think is missing in New Zealand manufacturing and business at times, is that someone has to have decision rights. So it's okay to challenge, but eventually someone has to hold the decision rights and make the decision on it. And then the expectation is that everybody gets behind that decision, right? Rightly or wrongly. Okay, because the person who made the decision is accountable for that. What that means in our organisation and that flat structure is that I don't hold decision rights on everything. You'll hear some CEOs, some managing directors talk about, some GMs talk about, I've got final rights on that. I can decide if you want to hire that person or not. I have the final right to say no. In our organisation, that is not the way it works. If I don't hold comparative advantage on that, and hey, there's a lot of decisions I do, but if I don't, then the person that does and has been awarded decision rights, which are earned, by the way, they make the call. and they're rewarded, just like in a free society. In business, every day we get rewarded through the market, through more profit, or vice versa, or we get punished through not as much profit, etc., by poor decision making. So yeah, that's sort of the philosophy behind that. It only works with a really high trusting team, but also a trusting leader. I don't always get that right as a leader. There's times that my team and I've had some real challenges around philosophies and things like that. But someone has to hold the decision rights in the end.
Brilliant. So by doing that, you're in some ways freeing yourself up of the cognitive load of having to manage all of that by passing it down to your team, and you can continue to focus up and out on where you're taking the business and so forth.
And sometimes I just won't make the right decision, Dave. If I'm hiring an engineer if we're hiring an engineer, for example, right? Am I the right person to employ that person, or is the engineering manager? Ultimately, it's probably the engineering manager. Am I the right person to decide whether we should go and make a capital investment on something that's going to improve the line? Hey, I might have an opinion on the financial part of it, potentially, but probably someone else needs to hold those decision rights about whether it's going to work or not, and whether we should do it. I think what you mentioned there is interesting as well, as I think often leaders in today just don't have enough capacity created for themselves, enough headroom to stop and think. And I can't operate with meetings stacked and just being up against it all the time, because I just don't think it's healthy. You lose creativity, you lose all those good things.
There's a nugget right there for people. I'm going to change the theme slightly and just think a little bit more macro. And you've been in an awesome position. You've been overseas for nearly 10 years. You've come back. You started your career in New Zealand, went overseas, got all that experience, that worldly sort of insights. What can New Zealand manufacturers, New Zealand Inc. in general, what should we be learning that's happening now overseas to lift particularly our productivity status, our performance status?
No, it's a good question. I think the first thing we need to probably do is remove the block that we're special, that we're different. I think sometimes in New Zealand we sit there and we think, oh, well, that doesn't apply to us because we're not in a standardized market, or it's a bit more cottage industry type stuff. So I think that's the first thing we need to do, right? Is we need to park those mental models that I think can stop us at times from borrowing and modifying, because we're actually awesome at that when we do that. When we get our heads around that as a country, as a society, as a people, we're awesome at modifying stuff. We always have been. What I'm saying is, from a manufacturing point of view, don't get blinded or freaked out, I believe, by this whole AI thing. It's a whole topic in itself, and I think it's got a place and it's slowly growing. But in manufacturing core, it's probably got a long way to go. I think what we can learn is that if you apply just good basic problem-solving, logical, methodical problem-solving skills and apply them to the biggest issues in your business, and you be patient about it, I think you end up getting 80% of the way there. And the first part of what I talked about around that block stops us from actually learning, hey, there's actually a way to do this, and that there's no silver bullet, and it's not sexy, and it doesn't happen overnight. Just need to take that. And I think you look in Europe, you look in the US, they're just better at that. They've done it for longer. They don't expect the results straight away. They often operate in more competitive environments where they have to do it. So I think that's the big thing I would look at if I step back and said, you just got to take these methodologies and apply them to your business. You don't have to label them anything. They're just good, logical approaches to things. And data is a big part of that. And there's some amazing tools out there that are not expensive that you can get the data, right? So people are getting better and better at getting the data. In fact, I've had some discussions with suppliers recently, and they go straight for the data, So you've got to protect your data, and it's because that's the new gold. And it can be super helpful as well if you're in the right partnership by letting them have it. But data can be taken from a clipboard and watching a process happen in a stopwatch, literally.
Yep, can be really simple. Well, what about the capability gap around leadership in the New Zealand Inc. and manufacturing?
Yeah, that's a dangerous topic because it's a heavily opinion based.
That's what we're about. That's why we're doing this. Just going back a step.
Yeah.
We started this podcast to really poke the bear because I think some of those fundamentals, that mental block that you described before, and we are special, and taking all of those excuses. David and I are quite strong about that. That's actually sometimes a lot of BS, and it's a cover up for some of the poor performance and probably lack of maturity in our leadership. So we're quite happy to put our own opinions out there, because that's where I think we're struggling, is to really own some of those weaknesses. And it's okay, like you said, around your problems. It's okay to own the problems, just as long as we're doing something about it.
Yeah. So, hey, I think I always fundamentally believe that leaders' roles are to take teams and people to places they didn't think they could go before. Okay. And that's not always a nice journey at times. But I think at times we look at leadership, two things in this country. We look at individuals and we basically tell them, unless you're a leader, you're going to limit what you can earn. You're going to limit your career. And so what we get is we get a lot of young people coming through, and they go, well, I have to be a leader. I have to be a manager. Or I have to be a supervisor because I want to earn more. Right? But in reality, those individuals, their comparative advantage might very well to be an individual contributor working on improving the business or in a sales role, or, they actually won't make a good sales manager. But what we do is we box people and we say, okay, well, if you want to earn more, this is the path you have to go down. What it's creating, I believe, is of course, not everywhere, it is creating a situation at times where we have people in leadership roles that are not fit to be in leadership roles. They haven't been trained. They're not the right personality, and they don't actually enjoy it. It can be pretty rough work being a leader at times. I think that's an issue. I think the other issue is we rely too much on leading hands, Rob and David. Like a supervisor is a supervisor, and I'm a supervisor in our organisation. Frontline leader as a supervisor. Now, I might supervise more senior people that are working on different problems to a frontline supervisor, but my core role as a supervisor / leader is the same. What a lot of New Zealand businesses are doing, in my opinion, is they're putting people into leadership positions either from the floor, like what we talked about earlier, where they shouldn't be, or we're asking them to be leaders and workers. So they're working with peers, and then we're asking them to manage or lead the peers. Right? And then we're killing their capacity because they've also got to go and make X amount of widgets, as well as develop and build a team that can make X amount of widgets or solve problems that are stopping the team from making more widgets. And I just think we've got that wrong. It's not done like that in the US. It's not done like that in Asia. But in New Zealand, we still very much feel that leaders should be on the tools and they should know how to do the job as well as the workers. And that's not right, in my opinion. A leader is a leader, and they've got a very specific set of skills that are very different from someone that actually makes a product or does the work.
Interesting. I'm really intrigued by that one. Do think we get caught in, again, David and I have been talking probably the last few months around that sort of raising technical expertise does not always equal leadership expertise. And we get that wrong, right? We
do.
Often it's, you're good equals you're going to be good leader.
Very different, in my opinion, very different worlds, right? Yeah. Every now and then you get someone that is incredibly talented technically that transitions to being a very good leader. That transition, though, when you go back and talk to those people, was often painful. Painful for them, painful for the organisation. They got there in the end. In the same essence, I've also seen people that are horrible technically, but make fantastic leaders because they have the right personality. They can engage with people. They can get their people around them to contribute more than another peer. And so I think leadership in this country needs to be celebrated more and seen more as a professional path, rather than a means to an end because I did this, but I need to earn more money, so I'm going to become a leader.
I've always had this saying, your captain is not always your best player in the team.
100%. Yep. No, that's dead right. And I just think we're not there yet. And I can't tell you why that is as a society. Maybe it's investment. Maybe we don't have enough scale yet. I'm not sure, but I think it's holding us back.
On a slightly more, aspirational or positive note,
Hmm.
from your perspective, like we talked about what we're not doing right, what are our opportunities? What are our strengths from your experience of setting up an awesome business in New Zealand, but again, your overseas experience? What are our nuggets that we're not tapping?
I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think this ability for Kiwis to solve problems, I think we're awesome at that. We're so good. Spending time, and I've spent time Middle East, Asia, the US, and Europe. We have this ability as Kiwis to just find a way. It's just in us, in most of us, right? And we see that through industry in New Zealand and some of even the innovation that we're producing and the tech stuff we're producing. So I think absolutely can be harnessed more. And if it's channeled in the right way, I think we'll see from a manufacturing point of view and productivity and just increase massively, because we can, it still amazes me at times where I sit there and I found this when I was in the US particularly. I could sit in a room and just go, hey, well, why don't we just do this? And people would be sort of like, wow. And there's 5 million of us down at the bottom of the world that actually think like this a lot. It's that number 8 wired mentality. So I think that's super positive. I think we're pretty relatable. I think as people, we've I don't know if it's a lack of class in New Zealand or like a societal class is what I mean, but we just tend to be able to relate to most people can relate to most people, as generic as that sounds. Most Kiwis can have a chat to a CEO, no problem at all, or a worker, and I think that's a real advantage for us too.
I just want to circle quickly back to that. We're really good at problem solvers, and we'll find a different way of doing that, which is quite different. And you touched on number 8 wire. I guess this is going back to setting that scene of excellence, right? The she'll be right attitude and we'll make it out of number 8 wire and we'll just get it done is quite different to we'll find a way but maintain excellence. Do you want to talk us through kind of the difference on that one?
Yeah, I think the she'll be right attitude, that doesn't work, in manufacturing if you want to be really good. I think it's the slightly different approaches, right? And I think what you raise is fantastic, and that it does get muddled a bit. Actually, now I'm sitting there thinking about that. They get lumped in together, but they're actually two different things, really, right? Like the sort of she'll be right. Well, that's one attitude, and maybe that ties more to our ability to relate to people and be a little bit more relaxed about stuff. But the problem solving is a different setup altogether, I think, and it's important people don't mix them. Actually.
Which is quite different. There's a cartoon or a stat that we use quite often, particularly around our country productivity stats, is, meet up with an Irishman, an Englishman, Australian, and American at the pub. The Irishman will be there at 5 o'clock because that's when he finishes work. For us to do the same output, we'll miss the American that gets there at 10 p.m. and the Australian that gets there at 11. We're there at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
Again, as a lean guy, that really frustrates me, but it really frustrates me hearing that we're really good at problem solvers, but it's telling me we're not investing our time into doing that into our business. We're not putting time aside into creating problem solvers in our business to create that excellence.
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, right, it's channeling that. Unfortunately, what I think we do is we channel it into a reactive mode, firefighting mode at times, instead of a proactive mode, and get ahead of that curve. Yeah, so it's all about channel, like anything. Plenty of people with a lot of different skills around the world, but if you don't channel it in the right way, it doesn't get used, or can be weaponized and used to negative, in a negative pathway.
Kiwis are great at innovation. We're great at invention. We see that with Team New Zealand. We've managed from the bottom of the world to beat these superweights in America's Cup. But what we haven't done is we haven't scaled this massive yachting industry around that innovation and invention. Do you think in some ways the innovation piece is the positive side of the double-edged sword, where we are also trying to multitask and be managers and contributors?
Yeah, I think there is a part of that. It's a little bit like what we talked about earlier, right? Ultimately, at times you do need people that are dedicated to solving problems, or people that are focused on solving problems. And I think that comes back to my point earlier about when you have a supervisor working on the floor, if you took all their time that they're working on the floor and said, I'm going to use that to solve a problem, that whole reactionary to being proactive would probably start to turn.
And then as you solve that problem, that's where your scale comes in.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. And it becomes a positive spiral.
Yes.
Right, not a death spiral. We often say in AGP, and it's a bit of a strange saying, but I'll say, hey, we're too busy throwing up to take the medicine. Sometimes you got to pause and take the medicine.
Going back on something else you've also said, you touched on AI and saying that, particularly manufacturing, it's a bit of a watch and learn approach at this stage, but there's a lot going on right across the whole sector. You've described how you run that operational excellence model, doing the basics insanely well. Then we've got these things called Industry 4 going on and a whole lot of noise. And from your advice to mum and dad, business owner, they're managing a team of 20 or 30 or something like that. What's your advice? Where would you start with all of that to sort of start getting up into that excellence status?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one I was thinking about before I came on here. Is for me, and again, that AI comment's a Dave opinion, right? As the way I see the world right now. Invest to get the data is probably the biggest piece of advice, and you can do that in very affordable ways. You can do it manually still, but at least get the data so that you can focus on what you need to work on, rather than what you think you need to work on. But my advice to smaller businesses, and we were one not so long ago, was that you'll get 90% of the gains through just simply, this is the issue, how do we solve that? It usually doesn't require a fancy piece of software or equipment to solve that problem. We'll go and put it in. We've had examples where in this business, the number one thing that was causing us issues we solved by putting a $100 audio alarm on a piece of equipment, and that was enough to notify the operator when a change needed to happen, and that was that. So that's just an example. So data, I'd start with data if you had to pick anything.
One of the most simplest data collection tools that I've ever used is a clipboard and a piece of paper out of the photocopy machine, and for a couple of weeks or even a month is just do telemarks of where was that error occurred. Was it machine, method, or materials, right? The 3 M's. And you just telemark it, and it gives you, okay, after 2 weeks, it's all loaded onto the machine. Now we know that we need to focus a little bit more on the machine. It's not anecdotal. It's just a pen, piece of paper, and a clipboard. As technical as you need to get, right?
Yeah. And when we did, actually, funny story, when we did the due diligence on this plant, a particular part of the plant had a lot of issues in the industry. And so my business partner and I, Brent Martin, we went to China. We went to look at this piece of equipment, and they said, how are you going to study it to make sure the uptime's good on it? And we sat there all day. We literally sat on top of this platform, a couple of cans of Coke next to us and a stopwatch. And we wrote down the times, these cycle times effectively. And that's how we determined, this is pretty reliable. And sure enough, now we've got similar stuff in our plant. We've got all the fancy ways to track that now. And guess what?
Just go and watch.
The data's the same. And there's been other times where, we've had to, as a team, come in and just spend time standing on the platform, looking at the cutting tables and, what is going on here? Let's just watch. And why is that stoppage happening? And you look back up the line and you do that to your point, you write that down enough times and you go, hey, I think it's this. You make a change, and sure enough, it was. And it didn't cost you anything to do that outside a bit of effort. And that's, time, effort, and that's honest. I honestly believe it's sort of 80-90%. And I know this because in a lot of companies as well, offshore that you work in as employees and things, they don't. It's hard to get capital. It's hard to get any money. It's hard. You've got to go through. I think where I worked before is to get a decent capex there was 11 approvals. Well, that takes months. So you actually end up having to solve problems with. And what we call is optimizing the base case, right? Yep. You don't need to spend money. You just get it to a point where it's absolutely as good as it can be without having to spend money.
Yep. Yeah, no, that observation, I get teams to do that. Lean, it's Ono circle from Taiichi Ono. He'd get his managers back in the day to stand in the circle and watch and write notes all day and to see what's happening in reality. Information data can tell you one thing. You need to see that reality and that human side of it as well. Awesome.
So I just thought if we could scale what you've achieved with AGP across other manufacturing leaders, what type of shift do you think we'd see in our sector or in the manufacturing sector, and also with our reputation for manufacturing?
I think our productivity index would increase. I think we've talked on that, and I think that's pretty well known. I think the one thing it would do is, because this is one thing that I do see a little bit different, is manufacturing in New Zealand's not sexy. It's not seen as a cool thing. And it actually is pretty cool. And we do some really cool stuff. We make cool products as a country. So I think it might highlight that, right, as a sector, and then that attracts better talent and young engineers and stuff. Instead of coming out and wanting to do design, which we hear all the time, they might go, actually, I've got a career in engineering and in manufacturing, or leadership inside manufacturing. So I think that's probably one of the big things, if you were to scale AGP up in our approach, that would happen, I think, at a very macro level. Of course, putting aside all the improvements in productivity and things like that. And I think government has a part to play as well, right? And incentivizing. And I see some changes, the depreciation and rules and things like that coming through, but it's still not really enough, to incentivize people. We were very lucky at AGP. Brent and I were in business with Mitch Plore, owns APL, and Craig Vincent, and there was a general commitment from the majority shareholder to have a 50-year vision. But that's not always that common, and so I think government has a part to play in helping that, and that'll help our sector as well.
And a timely comment, because we're recording this on budget day, so it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. And one of our next guests coming up has probably some influence in all of that, but I won't name that guest now, but that will be enough to tease people in future episodes.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, just getting towards the end of it, we've talked about what you do and how you've done it and some of your focus areas, and we've dabbled into the macro picture of what New Zealand Inc. could do, and even the government's role to play. And I do think that there's a role to play in government, but I still think that the sector has to step up to the line as well without cap in hand. It can do a hang of a lot without waiting for that silver spoon. But I do think that there needs to be a joint effort, making engineering and manufacturing sexy. Again, going down to the Hutt Valley Expo, there are teams down there doing fusion energy. I mean, if that's not sexy, leading the way in the world, they're doing stuff down there that MIT couldn't do.
Yeah.
So we just need to share those stories a lot
Absolutely.
more. We need to share your story, which is why you're on here. We need to share that a lot more and not be so humble. Grow and fertilize the tall poppies. I think we need to do a lot more with the cool parts of doing it. One of the things that we like to do on this podcast is to make all of this real, because what you've talked about, that's awesome. But for mum and dad business owner, again, they might have 10, 20, 30 staff, which is your typical SME. What can they do with the experience and knowledge and all the learnings that you've had and all the things that you've done right and wrong? What can they do Tuesday at 11 a.m. to start that journey for them? What would you, if you're mentoring them, what are a couple of things that you would go, right, start here, do this? What would that Tuesday at 11 a.m., what can they do that's that step ahead in that excellent space?
Yeah, I think it just starts with saying, okay, let's get out there, have a look at what's going on, start doing some tracking and getting some data or some information about, what are the big blocks here. It could be one particular plant. Most people know, most people that own a business or run a business, they know. They have a gut feel, and it's usually directionally correct. Head towards that area, start to collect the data, and then just start to solve the biggest problem that comes out of that, right? One at a time, put something in place. It doesn't have to be, sometimes I'll tell my team that the action item might be just simply for the next month to find out what the root cause is. That's all. And just put something in place, right? And monitor it, and then come back and do the same again in a couple of weeks' time, because you've still got to run the business. So that would be the first thing I'd be telling them to do, right? And then I'd be looking at their leadership systems and, what are their supervisors or their leading hands doing, and is that the best use of that resource if you want to keep moving things forward from a practical point of view. Again, it's not sexy, it's not hard to do. Anyone with good logical thinking can do it, and then just start to embed yourself in that cycle.
So if I translate that, it's putting time aside, not to firefight, but to solve problems.
Yes. Yep. Being deliberate about that approach.
Love that word, deliberate.
So, yep. Deliberate. That's key. I think sometimes deliberate with discipline is you can't beat that, right? And you need both, right? No use being deliberate for 1 week and then nothing happens. You forget about it for the next 6 weeks. You got to be very deliberate about it and make it a priority. The old adage that what gets measured gets worked is very true. I've seen it time and time again.
I'm going to take snippets out of this for my sales marketing efforts for lean programs. But yeah, in reality, I translate that into my lean world. That's leader standard work. You create a standard as a leader, put that deliberate time aside. It might be to observing, to find out or to even coach the team members how to do that problem solving if they don't have that skill set yet. But you've got to be deliberate, disciplined, and it's a long game. It's, as you said, it's not for a week. You start this is just how you do it every week.
Yep.
Okay.
That's right.
Excellent.
Pretty humbled to be invited on to talk with you both. And I think what made me want to do it was, if anyone takes just one little learning from this, it's good, and we should share this. And I think what you say there, Rob, is dead right. From a sector point of view, we should be more open about sharing knowledge, because that's how things improve and how our country will improve, and and if we don't make these improvements, our standard of living won't improve for my kids and future generations to come. So thanks very much. Right. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's okay. No, I appreciate that. It's been a wonderful little sidebar in my week, so I'm really pleased. I've been looking forward to this chat since we first met. So awesome.
Great.
Thanks, Dave, for being a guest on the Better SMB today. Some of my key takeaways: sitting on top of failures, having learned from them rather than being buried under them, having an entrepreneurial mindset and enabling your leaders to make decisions, thereby reducing your own cognitive load. We've also heard it's not sexy, and we've heard it a number of times, and that focusing on the daily actions, being deliberate and disciplined and consistent help you create a virtuous cycle of continuous improvement. So many takeaways, and we hope you've been busy handwriting notes like we've been when we've been recording this. We'll see you next time.